Dear, dear students of HSC second year class or class 12 in Rajshahi College, I welcome you all to this class of English second paper. Today I will discuss a revisional class on different types of verbs and their uses in English sentences. You can remember that I started second paper class in the month of April with a discussion on the verb patterns in English sentences, and since we have already finished discussing all the grammatical aspects in the syllabus, I am for the last few classes, I am in the last few classes discussing on the things which have already been discussed in this class for once. Today, let us see or let us make a revision on the verb patterns I told in the previous class. Well, in that class you can remember that English verbs are of three types. One, finite verbs. Two, non-finite verbs. And number three, auxiliary verbs. Among the three types of verbs, finite verbs are also known as main verb or the principal verb in a clause, not in a sentence. Remember it. Not only in a sentence, but also in a clause, because in a sentence there may exist, or a sentence may have more than one finite verbs, and all the finite verbs are also the main verbs or the principal verbs in the clauses. In a sentence, when the sentence has more than one clauses, or in other words, a sentence with more than one clause is called a sentence with more than one clause have more than one finite verbs. The number of finite verbs in a sentence determine the number of clauses in a sentence. For example, look at this sentence. Coming here, I told them to leave the place. In this sentence, we have three verbs coming, told, to leave. Among the three, the only one finite verb is told. Therefore, in spite of having three verbs, this sentence has only one finite verb. Similarly, look at this next sentence. He came here and was crying. In this sentence, we have two finite verbs. One is came and the other one is crying. Was is the auxiliary verb of the finite crying. That is, was is the helping or auxiliary verb for the finite verb crying. The function of was in this sentence is to determine the tense form of the verb crying. Carefully look at the verbs. I have mentioned as finite that all the verbs are in the tense forms and thus they are called finite verbs. To determine the finite verbs, to identify the finite verbs in a sentence, you need to know the rule. A finite verb always is in a tense form. You know, we have three tenses of verbs and all the forms of verbs, that is the present form, the past form and the future form, have all the tenses, the present, the past and the future, have four forms in each. Therefore, we have in total 12 tense forms of verbs. So, when we get a verb in a tense form, that is called a finite verb, and such a finite verb is sometimes used without any auxiliary verb, sometimes is used, sometimes are used with auxiliary verbs. For example, in the first sentence, told is a finite verb which does not have any auxiliary verb with it. In the second sentence, came is a finite verb. Both told and came are in the past indefinite form or simple past tense, and therefore they do not have any auxiliary verb. But the second finite verb in the second sentence, crying, is helped by the auxiliary verb was. Well, was is a be verb used often used as the auxiliary verb of some finite verbs, but a be verb can also be a finite verb in the sentences like this one, I am fine, or this was a book. This in the second sentence was, or in the first sentence am, both are finite verbs because they are not helping any other finite verb to determine the finite verb's tense form. Now we are ready to identify the finite verbs in a sentence. Well, in an extended discussion, I like to introduce you to the different types of finite verbs, and you see, other than finite verbs, principal verbs or main verbs, you are acquainted with the terms like transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and also linking verbs. All these are called finite verbs. All these are called finite verbs as a group. That is, either a transitive verb or an intransitive verb or a linking verb should be in either of the 12 verb forms. Finite verbs are of three types: transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verb. How do you identify these verbs? Well, many of you know can identify transitive verbs, many cannot. For all, I am providing a tips to identify transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verbs. You see, in general, since our early school days, since our introduction to English grammar, we have been learning that a sentence has a subject, a verb, and an object. I don't know how this concept of introducing English sentences or their structures first came in our mind, or who first took the effort of introducing English sentences or English sentence structures in this division. This is a purely wrong concept. Of course, a sentence have a subject and a finite verb. Always remember that. Always remember that without a finite verb, a sentence cannot be made, or without at least one finite verb, a sentence cannot be made. Sometimes in the imperative sentences we have the subject omitted, do it, or the subject implicit, do it now. For example, this is an imperative sentence, do is the finite verb of this sentence and its subject is implicit or not expressed. Therefore, in a sentence a finite verb is a must. Without a finite verb we cannot call it a sentence. For example, the boy standing there. The boy is standing there. Look, we have a verb standing. As a verb, its use is not incorrect but improper. But the use is improper because it does not make a sentence. Or taking tea. This is not also a finite verb because neither taking or standing, neither taking nor standing is in either of the 12 verb forms. You cannot tell it a continuous tense or perfect continuous tense because standing or taking does not have any auxiliary verb and therefore they do not make any particular tense form and thus they cannot be called a finite verb. And since there is no finite verb in the expression the boy standing there or taking tea, these are not sentences. To make a sentence you need to use at least one finite verb, and as I have said, each of the finite verbs make a clause in a sentence. Therefore, if a sentence has more than one finite verbs, the sentence means having more than one clauses. A sentence having more than one finite verbs is a sentence with more than one clauses. Anyway, I was discussing what elements can be there in a sentence. A sentence can have the elements or the units like subject, finite verb, object. Of course, there can be objects in a sentence after the finite verbs, but not only the objects, there can also be adverbs, complements, and participle or infinitive phrases. So, from today, forget the theory, forget the concept that a sentence has only a subject, a finite verb or verb and objects. You know what is a subject? Subject is the agent who does something expressed through the finite verbs. And what is the object? A noun or noun phrase after the finite verb which can be made the subject to change the finite verb passive. An object is a noun or noun phrase after the finite verb which can be made the subject of the sentence to change the finite verb passive. Let us look at the example. I have seen the man. I have seen the man. You can make this sentence passive. The man have been or has been, sorry, the man has been seen by me. Look, the verb seen, finite verb seen is made passive, and when we are making the sentence passive or when we are making the verb seen passive, we have made the noun phrase the man as the subject of the passive verb sentence. Well, this type of nouns or noun phrases are called objects. I repeat, objects can be made subjects to make the sentence passive, and an object is always a noun or noun phrase. Thus, we have learned what is an object. Now, we will see what is a complement. Instead of using the verb have seen, I became the man. I became the man. Look at this sentence. This same noun phrase the man is introducing the subject I. When the noun or noun phrase after the finite verb, when the noun or the noun phrase after the finite verb identifies the subject or qualifies the subject, it is called complement. So, a noun or noun phrase and sometimes an adjective qualifies the subject that noun or noun phrase or adjective is called complement. When a noun or noun phrase or adjective qualifies the subject of the sentence, that is called complement. In the sentence I am pointing, you see the man is used, noun phrase the man is used after the finite verb became, and this the man is qualifying the subject I. Therefore, the man is a complement. And if I write such a sentence, she felt sick. Sick is an adjective. This sick also qualifies she, the subject. So, sick is also a complement. Full stop. Well, and what is an adverb? An adverb determines the place, time of manner, reason or cause of the finite verb. Thus, when I write, he came here, this here qualifies the verb of the sentence. Where did he come? The place of the verb. Or we had gone on that day. This phrase on that day is an adverb because on that day determines the time of the finite verb gone. And we also have the other units in a sentence. Well, these are the not in a sentence, they can be called units in a clause. We have also participle phrases and infinitive phrases. When I discuss the participles and infinitives in this class or the next one, you will identify them better. Today, let me go back to the discussion on different types of finite verbs. As before returning back to the types of the finite verbs, let me make a revision of the units of a sentence. A sentence may have the units like subject, finite verbs, objects, adverbs, complements, and the participle and the infinitive phrases. It is not necessary all the units will be at the same time in a sentence. A sentence may have more than one units of the suggested units like objects, adverbs, complements, participles or infinitive phrases, but make sure that other than the imperative sentences, in all sentences, I repeat, other than imperative sentences, in all sentences we have a subject, and even in the infinitive sentences in which the subject is an implicit one, there must be a finite verb. Without a finite verb, there cannot be any sentence or clause. Therefore, the finite verbs can also be called the backbone of clauses and therefore sentences. Without a clause there cannot be no sentence, and without a finite verb there can be no clause. Therefore, if we have two finite verbs in a sentence, we have two clauses, and each of the clauses there is at least one, there is a finite verb. The highest number of finite verbs in a clause, not in a sentence. The highest number of finite verbs in a clause is 1, and the lowest number of finite verbs in a clause is 1. That is, a finite verbs makes a clause. Therefore, the number of finite verbs in a sentence determines the number of clauses in that sentence. Anyway, and now let us go back to different types of finite verbs. I have written that on the whiteboard that we have three types of finite verbs. They are transitive verbs, intransitive verbs and linking verbs. In order to give you a clear idea about the finite verbs, I have discussed the units of a sentence, because you need to know the units in a sentence to determine different types of finite verbs. For example, a transitive verb is followed by only objects. If there is an adverb or a complement after the finite verb, that is not a transitive verb. An intransitive verb is followed by an adverb or nothing after it. For example, I sleep. This is a complete sentence. After the finite verb sleep, we have nothing. So, it is an intransitive verb. Again, he had gone there last night. In this sentence, we have two adverbs. There is an adverb of place. Last night is an adverb of time. Therefore, the finite verb gone is followed by two adverbs. If we have an object and an adverb after the finite verb, like this sentence, like in this sentence, this man met you in the morning. Look, this man met you in the morning. We have the finite verb met, then we have the object you. You can make the verb met passive, changing you as the subject. You were met by this man, so you is the object, and in the morning is the adverb. And since we have an object, we will call this finite verb a transitive one. So, whenever we have an object following the finite verb, the finite verb is always a transitive verb. And what is a linking verb? A linking verb is followed by a complement. A linking verb is followed by a complement. As I showed you, I became the man in this sentence. The man qualifies subject I. The man is a complement, therefore became is a linking verb, and she felt sick. Felt is a linking verb because felt is followed by the complement sick. Sick. Thus, we have three types of finite verbs: transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verbs. The patterns of verbs do not occur in your examination question paper directly, but in second paper you may have the questions with the directives to write a transitive verb or an intransitive verb or a linking verb in a given sentence, or even a finite verb. Therefore, you need to know the use of the transitive verbs and the definition of the transitive verbs. And you may also be asked to write an adverb or an object or a complement in a sentence. You need to know the definition and use of objects or complements or adverbs in a sentence. That is why I am discussing these things again in this class, and that is why I am taking the revision of the verb patterns in this class. Well, we have two more types of verbs to discuss, as I told at the beginning of this class. Can you remember? They are: number 2, non-finite verbs; And number 3, auxiliary verbs. I will discuss their functions or uses in English sentences elaborately in the next class, because today I do not have enough time to discuss them. I will just give you the ideas about the non-finite verbs and auxiliary verbs. Look at the sentences. The man was beaten for stealing food, or we have been waiting to welcome. We have been waiting to welcome him. Look at the sentences. In the first sentence, the man was beaten for stealing food. In this sentence, we have 3 verbs: was, beaten, stealing. Among these 3 verbs, beaten is the main verb or the finite verb, because it is in the passive form and in the past indefinite tense. Stealing do not have any particular verb, and was do not have any particular function in the sentence. Was is used only to determine the tense form and passive form of the verb beaten. Similarly, in the second sentence, have been is helping to express the tense form of the verb waiting, and to welcome is not in any of the verb forms. To welcome, a verb in the basic form with a to, is called infinitive. Waiting is the finite, stealing present participle, waiting in the second sentence finite, and have been, well, was helping or helping, have been is the helping or auxiliary verbs. So, in the sentences we have the other verbs which may have functions but not any tense forms, or no functions but helps the finite to determine the tense form or verb form. These types of verbs are non-finite verbs and auxiliary verbs. To know more clearly, always remember that non-finite verbs are those verbs which have functions in the sentence but without the function, without any tense form. A non-finite verb is a functional verb without any tense form, and auxiliary verb have no function or non-functional verb used to determine the tense form of the finite verb. That is why an auxiliary verb is also called the helping verb. An auxiliary verb helps or used as the tense determining verb of a particular finite verb. So we have three types of verbs: finite verbs, non-finite verbs, and auxiliary verbs. Last point, when a sentence is made passive, it's when a sentence is made passive, it's a finite verb only. It's finite verb only. Its finite verb changes. Neither the auxiliary or the non-finite verbs change. Only its finite verb changes. I think today you have got a more clear idea about the finite verbs or the use of the finite verbs in a sentence. I have already told and now repeating that you will not be asked to write the definition or show the use of the finite verbs in your examination. But to understand the English sentences well, you need to know the verb patterns, because verb is considered the skeleton. Verbs are the skeletons. Verbs make the skeleton of English sentences, and among the skeletons, finite verbs make the backbone of English sentences. So with this, I close this class today. Thank you all. Hope to meet you on the 16th of this month to discuss the other two types of finite verbs, other two types of verbs in that class. Until then, wish you all the best. Good luck to you all. Thank you.